Right, so you are thinking about a biomass heating installation, and the train of thought may go, oh, well, actually, we're going to need a boiler. Oh, what are we going to burn? Let me get to this side; it might work a bit better. And well, actually, how much do we need? How big a boiler do we need? Well, we need to know what's the heat demand, and then there's fuel handling to think about. There's fuel storage to think about, and all these things are interconnected in various ways. The type of fuel that is available will impact on the type of boiler and the handling system, and how much fuel is available and when will impact on the storage. The amount of heat that you require will determine which fuel source is most appropriate to you, and obviously how big a boiler you need. It is all so interconnected. And like I say, one does affect the other, and to get all those pieces right, ultimately, is what's required to deliver a successful project. And that's the one thing about, I suppose, if you go away from here today with, is that biomass boiler installations are virtually unique to it, and the economics of it are virtually unique to every individual site. It's not just all right, we need one this big, thank you very much. No. Here we are, Matt, I want one of them. Yeah, and you beat the supplier up about price, and there's several of them will compete and offer exactly the same thing. That's not the case. It is a very bespoke installation and a very bespoke set of financials as well. Now, as you might expect from me, if you know me, heat demand, I'm going to say that's the big factor. And each of the speakers will say, well, actually, each of their topics is the big factor, which shows how, they are, to be fair, they're all equally important. But I'm going to focus on the heat demand side of things. Your starting point might be, well, I burn this much gas, and well, how many tons is that? That means I need 7,000 tonne of wood chip, for argument's sake. Another simplistic starting point might be, well, I've got a 10 megawatt boiler, so I need a 10 megawatt biomass boiler. That's simple. It gives you a feeling for the extremes, but you might end up with something this big, whereas in reality, you might need something that big. So this will equate with you, Richard. I took these pictures in Canada. It was also the direct relationship between digger size and boiler size and nursery size, if you like. But what I'm trying to lead through is just a few sort of approaches as to how you might size it, and some numbers to think around and bounce around, if you like. But you might be surprised the number of people who their first thoughts are something like this, and you can get scared off by the numbers. Never mind the fact that you need 7,000 tonnes of wood, or it's a 10 megawatt boiler and it's going to cost me however many £1 million or more. The optimal sizing and going through this whole process is very important to getting a successful job. Now, as a bare minimum, we really ought to be looking at your weekly heat demand. Now, I've got my typical 5-hectare nursery, just as an example. It's some real data from a site, just to give us some sort of vaguely sensible numbers to work with. Well, at the very least, weekly heat demand is what you need. And you look at that graph, and if you said, all right, well, I want to do everything from biomass, then you might, that's a big boiler that's going to be twiddling its thumbs most of the time. Probably not the most sensible solution, unless you aren't going to have any alternative heat source at all. The other extreme could be a boiler that's just going to satisfy the lowest week. And again, the chances are, you're not quite getting the benefits of economies of scale down that end of the spectrum. So the answer is going to be somewhere in there. And the ultimate question is, where within that band? Then you might say, well, let's look at the pattern of heat use within a day, because that's quite important to us. A winter's day, for example, well, if I put in a 4 megawatt boiler there, that's not too bad. The lowest point is shade under 2. That's about half the output of the boiler, and as Matt will tell you, that's a reasonable place to be. You wouldn't want to run a biomass boiler at less than, say, 30%. So, yeah, actually if I put a 4 megawatt boiler in for that, that would sort of, practically speaking, it would work. Might still be a little bit oversized. Well, then a few weeks later, you end up with days like this. And all of a sudden, yeah, you've got your 4 megawatt boiler. You want no heat at all from it in the middle of the day. And you can't just turn them off and light them up, like you do with your gas or your oil-fired boiler. So what happens then? So throwing a few more numbers around, if I put my 4 megawatt boiler in, if I run it flat out for 24 hours a day, that's near as damn it 100 megawatt hours of heat per day it could give you. Now that winter day that I showed actually had a total heat demand of 69 megawatt hours. So actually a 3 megawatt boiler would have satisfied that if it had run flat out 24 hours a day. That spring day, following similar numbers through, brings you down actually a 1.7 megawatt boiler would have kept that spring day happy. So quite a massive variation in boiler sizes that you might consider that can have quite a big input into your annual heat demand. Now, how do we facilitate that? Well, the edible growers among you, you have heat stores. That's part and parcel of being an edible crop grower. You use them as part of your CO2 enrichment facility, if you like. If you don't have CO2 enrichment, then you may not have heat stores at the moment. That could be a little bit more of a novelty or difference to you. So, and also an extra cost element that you have to consider that edible crop growers don't necessarily. But from my angle, from getting the right size boiler for the job, heat stores are a very important part. And as Matt will tell you, they're also an important part of having a relatively pain-free, easy to manage installation in the short and the long term. So keep those sort of numbers in your mind, sort of make 50 to 100 megawatt hours per day, if you like. And I said that's my 5 hectare nursery, if you like. So yeah, that's how a heat store works. We say, right, we've got this quite small boiler. It's running flat out all the time. Surplus heat here goes into the heat store. We need more than the boiler can do in these bits. We suck it back out of the heat store. In concept, it's quite simple. Yes, Richard. Could you just hold on a moment? We need to record your.
For this kind of example, what size of heat store would you suggest? Is it comparable with a gas setup?
I'm getting there. You're 3 slides ahead of me, so we're well attuned to each other. I'll lead you through this, and hopefully I'll answer the question for you. If I haven't, do shout up again. So some rules of thumb on heat store size, just to put a few things into perspective. If you have a 1,000 cubic meter heat store, nice round figure, and you have a working temperature range of 90 to 45, that's a formula how to work it out if you want to do it yourself. But the answer is 1,000 cubes will store 52 megawatt hours of heat under those conditions. Previously, if you remember, we were talking about 50 megawatt hours as the demand on my nursery on a spring day, possibly 100 megawatt hours on a winter day. In the middle of winter, back on that very early graph, a demand of 500 megawatt hours of heat a week wasn't far off if you ignore the really high ones. That's about 70 a day. Now, bear in mind, you don't need to store the whole day's worth of heat demand. You just need to take the edges off. There's still a low level demand in the middle of the day that's taking something from the boiler. So you might need to store about 30% of your daily demand in that winter heating situation, just as a approximate figure. What does that work out at? Well, that works out at about 400 cubic meters for my 5-hectare nursery, or 80 cubes a hectare. Now, that's a few numbers, a few examples, and that 80 cubic meter a hectare figure, if we compare it to the standard rules of thumb for an edibles nursery, the figure often quoted for an edibles nursery is 200 cubic meters a hectare for CO2 management purposes. So if you've got anything near that, you've already got plenty of heat storage. If you haven't got any heat storage at all at the moment, you're an ornamentals grower, for example, you don't want to be putting massive heat stores in that aren't going to deliver you a decent return on investment. So we need to know a bit more tightly, let's say, as to what you actually need. Now, as I said right at the beginning, the ultimate answer is very site specific. The chances are it will also come down, but the answer is very site specific. It might, practically speaking, come down to, particularly if you're using a second-hand heat store or a tank use for other purposes, ultimately what you can physically fit in, what's available. But we can drill down to it much more closely. A few years ago now, we did some work for HDC looking at biomass boilers and sizing of them and the heat demand patterns of a handful of edible and ornamental nurseries, and worked through boiler sizings and heat store capacities and what have you for each one of them. Now, as a very simple rule of thumb, the optimum boiler size is about a third of your peak heat demand. Don't assume that your current boiler is your peak heat demand, capacity is your peak heat demand. The chances are it's quite oversized for what you actually need nowadays, particularly if you've been putting in thermal screens or shade screens or what have you. The old rule of thumb of 2 megawatts a hectare of boiler capacity is for a high temperature crop is probably way over capacity now. So your actual real peak heat demand figure is what you need to get hold of. Don't just look at what your current boilers are plated at. In terms of heat stores, well, actually anything much more than about 50 cubic meters a hectare, from the point of view of managing and getting extra output from your biomass boilers, doesn't really deliver that much more. You get the exponential curve and it starts to flatten out, and any further investment in heat storage beyond that didn't show a sufficiently large increase in utilisation. What's it? It is specific to individual sites. Well, that'll give you a feeling for where it's at. With those criteria met, ignoring the fact of CO2 enrichment for a moment, which I know is important to some of you here, that sort of sizing should be able to satisfy 80 to 90% of your annual heat demand. Now, CO2 enrichment is an important factor to edible crop growers in particular, so we can't ignore it. As we stand, burning wood chip, straw, what have you, using the flue gases for CO2 enrichment from them is not currently proven. I was almost going to say possible there, but we are doing some work looking at that, and I'm increasingly convinced that it is technically possible. And I think it's only just round the corner that it will be possible to do, but you are looking at some fairly hefty capital costs and running costs to allow you to do that. So as we stand here today, the assumption is you can't use CO2 from the flue gases on biomass boilers. So what impact does that have? Well, the bits in orange are what's left after CO2 is taken account of. So through the middle of winter, you need a relatively little CO2. The vents are closed. The vents are all of a sudden, by the time you've reached sort of middle to end of April, basically, all the heat that you can use, you want the CO2 off the back of it. So you've got from the start of your crop to about here, when biomass boilers could do something for you, and you get to this point and you probably turn it off. Which feels a bit wrong from the point of view of a capital invested, but it's still got the ability to deliver about a good third of the heat that you need in such a situation. Clearly, you've got the benefit of having a heat store, whereas ornamentals growers would have to pay that, but then ornamentals growers can use their biomass boiler through the summer if you do have a good solid heat demand through summertime, which sometimes isn't the case for bedding growers and the like. Now, this is a biomass boiler workshop, and now I'm going to mention CHP very briefly. But CHP gives you twice as much CO2 per kilowatt hour of heat that you've got to do something with. So, if I had a CHP that delivered the same amount of CO2 as burning that much gas would have through a boiler, that's the amount of heat you put into the system. But you won't need more heat than that in the nursery. So it means that all this orange bit is suddenly open to a biomass boiler. So perhaps a little alternative thinking about CHP, let's say, from what we've become used to in the past, means that CHP to give you as much CO2 as you're used to, combined with a biomass boiler, could leave you with the same CO2 enrichment levels, same yields, but lower overall energy costs. Obviously, significant capital requirement for CHP, but it's an interesting synergy there. Really, to wrap it all up, if we go through the numbers for my hypothetical 5-hectare nursery, I'm saying, right, I needed 25,000 megawatt hours of gas. That's about 500 kilowatt hours a square metre. So on the high side for many ornamentals nurseries, and on the reasonably sort of efficient side for edibles nurseries. If I put in a boiler that's about a third the size of my peak capacity, so a 3 megawatt boiler, I satisfy 80% of my heat demand, so I haven't got a CO2 issue. I'm going to need about 5,700 tonnes of wood chip. If CO2 enrichment is an issue to me, it might bring us down to 40%, so funnily enough, it's half as much in terms of tonnes of wood chip. So these figures, starts to give you a feel for the actual numbers involved, and John's going to use these in some of the examples that he works through later this afternoon. So just to wrap this up, really, heat demand, very important to know your heat demand in as much detail as possible. If you don't have even weekly fuel readings, whatever that fuel happens to be, do it when you go home now. So whether it's Matt sizing a boiler, or Glyn, or ourselves doing things, that the ready availability of that type of information is absolutely vital to working out what the best solution for you is. Yeah, the more data, the better. We regularly extract data off greenhouse computers, for example. Yeah, pipe temperature data and the like. I mean, it depends how. Sometimes, as you might see this afternoon, sometimes the numbers may look. The simple numbers might look good enough to you. So, well, actually, even if we're 20% off market, it doesn't matter for argument's sake. But the more information, the better. You can be sure of getting things sized in the best possible way, and ultimately getting the best possible result financially. And practically the best the least hassle. Finally, energy efficiency still rules. Don't think that cheap heat sources mean that you don't have to. Energy efficiency isn't quite the focus point that it was. Energy efficiency generally takes the top end off your energy use. That's, if we're sizing a biomass boiler correctly, that's the bit of energy use that would still be satisfied by your gas boiler, your oil boiler, or whatever it happens to be. So, yeah, it will reduce your energy costs. It will also reduce the size of boiler that you need, and therefore reduce the capital and all those sorts of things as well. So, keep your mind on using less heat, no matter where it comes from. That's that piece. And any questions? Do we answer your heat store questions adequately? Marvelous. Anybody else? No? Right, well, we'll move straight on to Matt.